Goldfarb Library at Brandeis University, welcome to Recall This Book, a podcast dedicated to making sense of contemporary problems by activating writing from the past. We believe you can only notice what's exceptional and unprecedented in the present if you take a hard look at what's gone before. You could say we look backward to see into the future. Over the next half hour, we'll explore a couple of works in depth and conclude by pointing you towards further reading on the topic. Recall This Book is hosted today by Elizabeth Ferry, an anthropologist now writing about gold and Colombian and Mexican mining and finance, and by me, John Plotz, a professor of Victorian literature currently writing a history of science fiction and fantasy. Today, we're joined by media historian Lisa Gitelman as we explore old new media. Our conversation will cover the difference between unique artworks and those destined for mass circulation, and we'll also ask which old media innovations were most comparable when first introduced to new arrivals like Twitter and blockchain. We'll also end with recommendations for further reading, and we will also debate whether Kipling was paying a compliment to the newest technology of his day when he compared radio to a delirious dying man psychically channeling Keats's Eve of St. Agnes. So, welcome to Recall This Book. So there's a line from We Won't Get Fooled Again by The Who that I often think about. Here comes the new boss, same as the old boss. So because I'm the kind of nerd who studies the ways that women novel readers in the 19th century were depicted as sex-addicted zombies and the ways that people feared moviegoers in the early 20th century were going to be robbed of their free will by the flickering power of the screen, that quote about new and old bosses helps me think about the way that some of our contemporary fear of the internet age, the age of electronic transmission, gets amplified when we look back into the past. How much of what we fear in today's changed forms of attention, of reading, of watching, of texting, falls into the category of here comes the new media revolution, same as the old media revolution? And how much of it is just genuinely new? Are we heading towards, or have we already entered a cognitive upheaval that is caused by the way that big data streams all around us now and carries us off into parts unknown? Today's authors are Walter Benjamin and Rudyard Kipling, both from the beginning of the 20th century, an unlikely pairing, but as the old jingle said, they may be two great tastes that taste great together. So to explore that set of questions around old and new media, we are very lucky to have Lisa Gitelman join us today. She is a professor of media studies at NYU and the author of numerous works in the field of media studies, including 2 books that form a perfect introduction to this topic. From 2006, Always Already New, Media History and the Data of Culture, and in 2014, Paper Knowledge Towards a Media History of Documents. Paper Knowledge Towards a Media History of Documents. Lisa, welcome to this Public Books podcast.
Well, it's a delight to be here. Thanks a lot, John.
So in a more perfect world, I actually think we could just devote ourselves to exploring and reading aloud from Lisa's own writing on this topic. But as you know, the format of this podcast asks its hosts and its guests to choose texts from the past that seem to shed a sideways light on our own present situation. The idea is to try to shake up the terms of present debate by considering how the topic, in this case, what is a new media and how different is it from old media, was approached in earlier times when a different version of this question came up. So, Lisa, you brought with you today a timeless essay by Walter Benjamin, timeless but first published in German in 1935, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And for those of you following along at home, you will find a link to Harry Zone's English translation of the essay on our website. Lisa, can I ask you to just tell us a bit about the essay and why you chose to discuss it?
Sure. So this is a classic essay. I think if you shook awake any media studies major the world over in the middle of the night and said Benjamin to them, they would, without thinking, draw something from this essay and whisper back to you, Aura, A-U-R-A.
Yeah, and if you said Benjamin to you, they would say, no,
What?
Benjamin.
Yeah, somehow we say it that way. But anyway, it's a classic essay. It was written by Benjamin in the 1930s, as you said. He was a German Jew in exile in Paris under kind of extreme duress at a moment of great kind of unknown in the world, both personally and politically. Very unsettled times or uncertain times, and this was a political condition, a personal condition, as well as something having to do with media, because Benjamin was really kind of clocking in new media of reproduction, textual reproduction and image reproduction. The essay has a lot of different moving parts to it. It's complex. There are lots of pieces. In addition to this word aura that comes up importantly, it's an essay that focuses on the what Benjamin sees as the kind of power, and in this case, positive power of photography as a new art form, and cinema as a new kind of mass art form as well. So I thought it was very appropriate because it's Benjamin thinking about new media at a moment when the question of media seemed important in lots of different ways.
That's great, Lisa. Can I ask, I mean, it's totally to put you on the spot, and you don't have to have an answer on this, but you mentioned photography and film, or the moving picture, as the two new ones. Can you sort of position those two for us in terms of what Benjamin is doing with putting photography and which actually isn't that new in 1935, but like photography and film, which is pretty new.
Pretty new, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. So Benjamin sort of picks up photography as a contrast to painting or to the original graphic arts. And that's where the idea of the aura comes in. A painting has this uniqueness, an aura, a presence, if you like, a kind of autographic essence that photography doesn't. It doesn't make any sense to say which is the original photograph. We seem to be in a completely different domain when we get to photography, and Benjamin wants to theorize that. He wants to see its kind of political ramifications in terms of a cultural politics, but also in terms of some, kind of utopian future for on a kind of proletarian good place to live. And cinema comes in as kind of the second act there, because I think Benjamin, again, in this essay is quite optimistic. He's looking at Soviet cinema and seeing cinema as a way, first, that workers can represent themselves, that sort of every man can be in film the way Soviet cinema was then sort of charting a course. But he also thought about film as a kind of training ground for our modern existence, right? That it was a training in the apparatus of modernity in some way, if used correctly, right? If used, in the ways that his exploration of photography seemed to suggest new, kind of mass democratic forms might have.
If you had to think about the new forms right now that lined up with photography and film the way Benjamin is, do things come to mind for you as one of them works like the way Benjamin is saying photography did, and one of them is working the way he said film is?
Well, I mean, we hear the same things about digital media, right? In a way, when you get to a place when you're saying, well, what's the original of a photograph? You're talking about the memescape. We're now in the place of absolute non-originals. And we have to ask, is there a real cultural politics to that? Is it the one that Benjamin expected? I'm not so sure. There are other parts in this essay where he dwells on, again, the worker being able to represent themselves in cinema, but even in print, in newspapers, that everybody can write a letter to the editor instead of authorship being this sort of sacrosanct domain. Yeah. And there, I think, all of our, contemporary digital media have really played a role in making us all authors. Yeah. And I think in the 1930s, that was still a kind of radical realization that we were reaching a place where we could all be authors instead of just all be audience.
Yeah, actually, Elizabeth, I was wondering, as an anthropologist, if you had thoughts about that funny thing in Benjamin where he actually seems to be complaining because people have too much access to the means of production. That is that now everyone can be an author, and therefore the category of author. I'm not sure he uses the word debased, but he certainly uses the notion of something like the authority of authorship being undermined. And I feel like nowadays we often hear that touted as the great democratic equalizer of, everybody can have their own YouTube channel. So did you have a take on that, Elizabeth?
Yeah, John. So I agree. So in this passage that you're talking about, he begins by saying that for centuries a small number of writers were confronted by many thousands of readers, but that now the distinction between author and public is becoming smaller and smaller, and is, he says, about to lose its basic character. And clearly, that distinction is way smaller than it was even then. It's that process has gone way farther. But I also think there is a kind of ambivalence in the passage about the tension between the democratization of the means of cultural production and the decline of expertise. And it's kind of interesting since he's himself a writer, so maybe he has a certain sense of proprietariness. But it also seems connected to what you were saying before, Lisa, about the sort of mood of the text. I totally agree that this is basically a very optimistic text and a call to pay attention to the positive possibilities of these changes in mechanical reproduction. But there's also some ambivalence earlier as well. So, for instance, when he introduces the term aura, he says that which withers in the age of mechanical reproduction is the aura of the work of art. And goes on to talk about the shattering of tradition. So when an object or a work of art was traditionally unique and authentic, and made authentic by its context, then it had this aura, and that aura was the aura of tradition. So the kind of ripping away from that aura constitutes, he says, a tremendous shattering of tradition, which is the obverse of the contemporary crisis and renewal of mankind.
So, Elizabeth, are you saying then that we haven't come that far from 2018, that the same forms of anxiety around new media and the notion of like purely falsified photographs, as Lisa was saying, or purely random YouTube where everybody's dog has their own YouTube channel, that same fear of loss of authenticity, that fear that I think Marx talked about of all that is solid melting into air, it just feels like a repetition compulsion?
Well, as usual, I want to say yes and no. It seems to me, let me say it this way. I like the method that Benjamin and other people use of sort of thinking about one particular, in this case, technological change, and then what are its cultural and social ramifications. I find that, very compelling. Obviously, I'm not unique in finding it so. So based on that method, you would then assume that these are different changes, different technologies will have different kinds of effects. And I sign on to that idea, more or less. I think the anxiety surrounding these changes is a lot more enduring than we might think. You talked about this before, John, about the 19th century women readers of novels were sex-crazed maniacs or whatever it was you said. And that I recently read an article about a sort of scare in the early 90s that was expressed in a whole bunch of different news stories about women who became addicted to the internet or addicted to their computers and left their marriages and neglected their children. So that seems really similar.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a way in which, without even realizing it, we've sort of let authenticity go. And Benjamin put it in again, seeing the contrast between the original work of visual art and the photograph, put it in terms of the kind of cultic presence of the artwork. And that cult presence was partly, as you say, made out of context, the fact that so few people would ever be able to see it or even know what it looked like. And that we've let go in ways that I think we don't even acknowledge day to day. It's not part of our framing understanding of what we're doing now, that's gone.
Actually, Lisa, can I jump in on that? You mentioned to me in conversation a distinction between the autographic, meaning the kind of authentically primary place and time located artwork versus the allographic, meaning the artwork whose identity is actually bound up in reproduction, replication. So as somebody who studies 19th century novels, that's all about the allographic quality. So did I just hear you say that where we are now is that we don't treat the autographic as having any primary aesthetic status at all, that it's all allographic all the time?
Well, no, I think we've tipped certainly, but we still cherish things from the hand of the author, the hand of the artist. We live in a celebrity culture, and that means sort of association possessions are still valuable to us. We haven't trashed
People
that.
still pay $30,000 to be with Britney Spears just before she goes on, like to be in the room where it happens.
True, and you can have a blockbuster museum show now that will make a rare painting accessible to millions.
We're still talking about the notion that the presence.
Yeah, it's a handy distinction from Nelson Goodman about artworks that depend upon the autographic original and art forms that are more allographic. So think about a piece of music. It's not like the piece of music exists in its essential essence someplace. It has to be in its reproductions. So it has a whole career, and we could ask all kinds of things about the conditions of the reproduction of pieces of music to learn more about the pieces of music. This is that old joke, so the Mona Lisa is in the Louvre Museum in Paris. Where's Hamlet?
Yeah.
Hamlet is everywhere, right, that its reproductions are.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, that might be a good time for us to pivot to turn to the podcast's second text, which is a short story by Rudyard Kipling. And yes, that is the same Rudyard Kipling you might remember fondly from childhood for The Jungle Book and for adventure stories like Kim. And of course, you might also remember him not so fondly for his horrifying poem from 1901, The White Man's Burden. So he has a complex legacy for sure. But today I thought we could look at Wireless, which is a short story he first published in 1902, and you will also find it on our website. So in brief, this is a story from the very early days of radio. In fact, the first line of it is, "It's a funny thing, this Marconi business." And it seems to be a story about a radio transmission, only it switches midway through from being about radio transmission, literally moves into another room to a very different kind of transmission, which is a tubercular young man, a druggist, who suddenly finds himself in a trance state channeling Keats.
I don't know what to make of this wacky story, but I think you're right that it does point to the persistence of the aesthetic and aesthetic works in the kind of ethereal realm, both a kind of subconscious, this person has obviously metabolized Keats in some way.
There's a really interesting doubleness in this story because in some ways, the radio transmission is like the transmission of the Keats poem to the consumptive assistant, and in some ways it's different. So there's this sense of the aesthetic ether as opposed to a kind of atmospheric ether, and the whole kind of difficulty of transmission and sort of coming through in bits and pieces is reproduced in both cases. But for the enthusiasts, the radio enthusiasts who are trying to make this connection, it said several times that, we're transmitting to Poole, I think, but it could be anywhere. This is just, it happens to be to this place that we're transmitting. And then also it doesn't really matter what we say. Whereas in the case of the Keats poem, it definitely matters what is said. There's this kind of constant revision, trying to get it right. And it also matters that it's this particular consumptive guy, there's a sort of sense that something about the, tubercular spores are like the receptors for this message.
Okay, so Elizabeth, I'm going to push back on that one a little bit because I think he becomes a reception station in the same way that the radio station is ripe to receive. So ultimately, this is a minor plot twist, and believe me, it's not a spoiler for the story, but it turns out they never get their reception from Poole that they were looking for, but they do overhear a couple of ships in the North Sea, maybe, talking to one another, and that's because their induction microphone is set up in just the right way. And at one point, the narrator of the story says about the tubercular young man that he's, quote, an induced Keats. And so induced there might mean like induced in a medical trance state, but it also means induced like an inductor microphone, which I imagine is the kind of microphone we're actually talking into right now. That is, that it's a microphone that can somehow capture the sounds out of the air, just because of a quirk of configuration.
I see what you're saying. I think you're right that there's like a convergence in the forms of transmission with him as a reception station. But I still see a difference between the two modes, because not only do the words really matter, but it seems to really matter that this guy has tuberculosis, as Keats did. Keats died from tuberculosis, and that there's this kind of essential connection to them between the two of them, between Keats and the receptor, which goes beyond which isn't transferable.
I think I agree. I was going to sort of pick up a different thing and agree that it seems like this is a story that picks up a question for the future. And to the extent that it picks up the question of the future about like the mathematical theory of communication, it's picking up that question of whether we need to think in terms of semantic content at all. And semantic content in this case is poetry. I think this story also picks up a kind of neat question for the present of 1902 about wireless, because nobody really understood, I think, really what wireless was. And I just wanted to clock in for a second that it really just been 60 years or so that people had been clocking in wirefulness, right? The world was really newly wired in some way that had suddenly, I think suddenly 50, 60 years, become intuitive. And wireless comes along and just seems like the radical unmaking of modernity in the name of some future modernity. And I think that's where some of the uncanniness of the story and the context come from.
That's great. That actually completely goes to my future recommendation, which is the Henry James story about a telegraph operator. So I think that's a really good point about the wired and the wireless. And I actually kind of want to use that to pivot to 2018 a little bit and again ask that question of like, so what is the contemporary analogy there, where we thought we understood the World Wide Web, but now there's suddenly Web 2.0, where there's the sort of the new iteration of that. What's the equivalent for us of the thing that we clearly have to grapple with, but we were just getting used to the last digital revolution, and all of a sudden this new one comes along.
Well, I'm not sure this is the best analogy, but I guess that the emergence of blockchain currencies that are based on blockchains is something that people feel we're hovering on the brink of a whole new way of thinking about exchange and what underwrites it, and that we just got used to things like credit cards and so on. I suppose that could work as an analogy.
And so, Elizabeth, for those of us, and I'm not saying I'm one at all, but for those of us who are ignorant of the nuances of blockchain, just don't tell me the insides of blockchain, but tell me the takeaway for what you think is significant about the implications of blockchain's kind of open sharing of information, or however you understand it.
Oh boy, I bet I could have predicted you would ask me that. So what people who are very excited about blockchain say is that because it is based on this idea of a distributed ledger, a sort of open ledger that everybody has equal access to, and that is kind of immutable because of the way the code is set up, that is, the past is immutable, that it does away with the need for, banks or centralized authorities to be issuing currency, and that has all of these, implications that its supporters think are super liberatory and its detractors think are potentially catastrophic.
Oh my God, so it's the ultimate allographic transactionality, because everything is available, is verified precisely by it being replicated in different forms.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'd probably, maybe add a postscript to that. I think, blockchain is, we're trying to wrap our minds around it. It does depend on massive computing power, right? So it has this big ecological dimension to it that people are rightly getting quite concerned about.
That's really interesting, because I was pursuing a different chain of thought, and I was thinking of it in terms of social mediation. And this could easily be because I'm the parent of teenagers, but I was thinking about that notion of that what's really at stake is the amazing way that people build out their social networks without relying on face-to-face interaction. That is, that we of my generation anyway, we have this kind of fear of the idea of a presence that is a presence of electronic mediation. But I think that a younger generation has no fear about that. Like, they take for granted that it's not we don't live in an age of transmission, of a kind of 1 to X transmission. We live in an age of an X to X interaction.
Well, and it's an absolute publicness that is in keeping with the blockchain technology. And yet, John, you managed to get out of bed in the morning. This doesn't sound like a utopia to me, or a very sort of positive, optimistic turn. And yet, we've been pretty upbeat.
Yeah. Well,
where do you see hope here?
Well, see, to me, but everybody else thinks I'm insane. But I actually think that one of the things that's really interesting about the mediated age that we live in is that the constraints of reproduction are actually enabling constraints by the following analogy, that Twitter is like haiku. I'm sure people have said this, so forgive me because I'm missing the people who've pursued this argument. But of course, you can understand Twitter as just free stream of consciousness venting. I can't think of anyone who actually just vents on Twitter, but I'm sure there must be people who do it. But on the other hand, that limit of characters kind of feels like the haiku limit. And so you're, in other words, producing a new kind of a set of paradigms for what it means to have an aesthetic relation. Yeah, an enabling constraint. So in wireless, one thing that's notable is that Kipling keeps running through different metaphors for how poetic inspiration might look like an inductive microphone. So he says, in my own brain, something crackled, like at the moment that he recognizes that this is Keats. And he's talking about his brain as if it were a radio, a circuit or a magnetic loop that's closing. In other words, new metaphors that allow us to reconstitute an aesthetic. Lisa's looking at me with a gentle smile, like, "Oh, you poor sap! I can't believe that."
I guess going back to Benjamin, one of the things that even though this essay is quite optimistic in many of its, if ambivalent in many of its observations, he did see with incredible keenness the way that the emergence of fascism was, in a sense, the kind of aestheticizing of politics. And I think we need to have kind of similar concerns today about our media and centralization and decentralization, those questions of longstanding, but also how power is mystified, aestheticized, and the like.
So that actually brings us to the final portion of this podcast: recallable books. So Lisa, what book are you going to urge our listeners to recall from the library or head off to find at their local bricks and mortar, cat-friendly, hippie teenager employing style bookstore that I know you frequent?
Okay, well, I prepared something. Since we were talking about an essay, Benjamin's essay, I brought along just another essay. So low stakes.
Awesome.
There is a recent essay by the sociologist Bruno Latour and Adam Lowe called "The Migration of the Aura, or How to Explore the Original Through Its Facsimiles." And this is an essay that explicitly takes up Benjamin's essay on the work of art and the age of its technological reproducibility, and does some new things to it, in particular looking at digital reproductions and what, if Benjamin is looking at photographs, what digital imagery can do or say to help us with thinking about the same kind of questions in the present moment. I should say that this essay appears in a book called Switching Codes that was edited by Thomas Bartscherer and Roderick Coover.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa. And I'm sure we can put a link to that up on the website so that people can figure out a way to access it. Thanks. And Elizabeth, what about you?
Yeah, so I also want to talk about an essay called Mobile Phones and Mipoho's Prophecy, The Powers and Dangers of Flying Language. And it's written by my colleague, anthropologist Janet McIntosh here at Brandeis. And she's interested in the ways people in the town of Malindi, Kenya, text on their cell phones. And they use 2 different languages when they're texting, English and Kigiriama, which is a local language. They use them about different kinds of things. The English is often about things that have to do with mobility, youth culture, and cosmopolitanism. And the Kigiriama is often in situations that have more to do with family, respect, obligations, formality. And by the same token, the English is often abbreviated in these kind of condensed forms that we can recognize in text. I think it's familiar to us. Whereas the Kigiriama is always fully spelled out. So there's a sort of, and this really reproduces ideas that people have about these 2 languages and the kind of social interactions that they represent. So I think it's a really good example of how there's both, the endurance of forms of social life that predated texting and the particular platform of texting and how it might change things. So I recommend it to you, and it's available on our website.
Awesome. Thanks, Elizabeth. And we can also put up a link to that. And I'm actually going to use a little bit of pride of radio and say I'm really sorry. I would love to recommend Henry James's In the Cage, but I am sort of committed instead to recommending one of the first post-H.G. Wells stories, which is E.M. Forster's 1909 The Machine Stops. And we'll have that up, the text of that in full on the website. So that brings us to the end of this really fascinating discussion and this Public Books podcast. So once again, Elizabeth, thank you for being my co-host, and Lisa Gitelman, thank you very much. Delighted to have you as a guest in these inaugural few.
Great to be here.
Awesome. Well, we'll have you back, I hope. Okay. All right. Goodbye for now.
Recall This Book is the brainchild of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. It's recorded and edited in the Media Lab of the Brandeis Library by Plotz, Ferry, and a cadre of colleagues here in the Boston area and beyond. Sound editing is by Anil Tripathi in the Anthropology Department, and production assistance, including website design and social media, is done by Matthew Schratz from the English Department. Mark DiLello oversees and advises on all technological matters, and we appreciate the support of University Librarian Matthew Sheehy and Dean Dorothy Hodgson.
We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. You can email us directly or contact us via Twitter or on our Facebook page and our website, recallthisbook.org, where you'll also find links to the text discussed today and suggestions for further reading and listening. Finally, if you enjoyed today's show, please be sure to write a review or rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts, and to share the episode with friends via social media or however else you do that, including hollering out the window. For a podcast with no commercial affiliations and no budget for publicity, your kind words are the single best way, maybe the only way, to get the word out. From Recall This Book, this is John Plotz along with Elizabeth Ferry and Lisa Gitelman saying thanks for downloading or streaming this show about old new media and about Walter Benjamin's work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction and Rudyard Kipling's story, Wireless.